What is up, everybody? Welcome to the 4for Formula One podcast presented by 4for4.com and today's Saudi Arabian Grand Prix preview. After a crazy morning of qualifying, we'll go over the results from that qualifying, go over some DFS strategy, and talk about some bets to target. I'm your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com, with my co-host, Dan Weiner, the senior producer at BetSperts. Dan, what's up, buddy?
Not much, man. Crazy weekend of Formula One, and we haven't even gotten to the race yet.
Yeah, I mean, compared to last week when, obviously, at the end of that Bahrain race, we saw some cars crap out, but, pretty much everything went mostly as expected last week. Already with qualifying, nowhere close to that. So if you are new to the podcast or heard about how much fun F1 was last week with the first week ever of DFS and want to dip your toes into the water, I'd really encourage you guys to check out that first podcast from last week. At least the first 20 minutes, we really go over why we think F1 is going to be really fun and why you should try it as a DFS game. And I mean, this like just having this show right now is part of the reason why I'm excited about Formula One as a DFS contest. Qualifying ended about an hour and a half ago. You and I are doing this with very little time to prepare, and there isn't a lot of time to get content out for people that are interested in this game. And that's why I think if people are really buckling down over this 18-hour period between qualifying and the actual race, there just isn't a lot of time to digest what's going on or for content producers to get content out. So, we're doing this as quickly as possible with the information we have, and I think it's going to make for a really fun DFS game.
Yeah, and it's like last week, it went according to plan, or at least it went how we thought it was going to go until it didn't with the Red Bulls crapping out at the end. This week, I am way less confident in just the sense of how things are going to play out. Mm-hmm. I think some of the strategies that we tried last week, I think some of them will still be good, but I still think that there's just so much variance. It's going to be my word every time I'm on the show with just the unfamiliarity still with this track in year two, the new cars, just there's a lot going on, and it's going to be really interesting to see how this race unfolds. Last year, there were a couple of red flags in Saudi Arabia, and it was kind of a chaotic race. Yep. Max and Lewis both had just craziness at the top of the race too. So it was exciting. It's a very dangerous track, as we saw, unfortunately with the Mick Schumacher crash during qualifying. But as far as the race goes, yeah, man, I have no idea what to expect, which as a fan is going to be really exciting. As a DFS player, probably a little bit tricky, but hey, we're going to jump headfirst into it and see what we can come up with.
Yeah, and I like the trickiness. Obviously, you don't want to see incidents, but compared to last week, just the likelihood of incidents is going to be a lot higher. And I think that's why I'm excited, especially for these first few weeks. I just, from what we saw today and not knowing, what drivers are actually as good or as bad as they showed last week, in addition to how volatile this track could be in terms of potential crashes, I don't know if what we saw that worked in DFS last week is necessarily going to work this week. But let's jump into it. Let's just quickly go over practice and mostly qualifying and talk about those results. I think, do you have something to throw up for what we saw from results today? So, the two biggest surprises, I think, are Sergio taking pole at the very last second and Lewis Hamilton not even getting out of Q1. Any thoughts on those two things right now?
The Hamilton thing is the craziest thing.
Yeah.
Hamilton hadn't missed or hadn't failed to get out of Q1 under normal racing conditions, so minus penalties or whatever, since 2009.
Yeah.
The last time he didn't do it at all was 2017, so it's been a long time. Yeah. And he just seems to be struggling to get a hold on the car. He was way behind. Forget the leaders, forget Red Bull and Ferrari. He was way behind his own teammate.
Depends on teammate. That's really the concerning thing, right? If we see, if we would have seen Russell and Lewis Hamilton both barely squeeze into Q2 or something, then it's okay, maybe they could figure it out. But for Lewis specifically to finish that far behind a teammate, anybody that is even vaguely familiar with Formula One, that's just not something that happens.
Right. And to go back to something that, the big story of the day outside of this race specifically, Haas did just announce Mick Schumacher will not race tomorrow, and they're only going to run one car. So that's going to affect a lot of things.
So before we jump into that specifically,
sorry, I just wanted to
give I mean, that's one of the biggest points that we want to talk about. Sergio takes pole, Max finishes fourth. Those results in terms of how the teammates finish, obviously a little bit surprising, but it tells us what we pretty much know, right? They sandwich the Ferrari drivers, so Red Bull, Ferrari, clearly the cream of the crop, right?
Oh, 100%. However, and we have a commenter, Dusty Bender, who I think makes an interesting point that's going to be interesting to follow. He says he has some reliability concerns with the Red Bull cars, and I think that's fair. We saw what happened last week. We saw what happened, so two of the cars crapped out, or both Red Bulls ended up not finishing the race. We saw Pierre Gasly not finish the race, and then Yuki Tsunoda's had a nightmare of a week. So it's fascinating because, man, that Red Bull car is really, really fast. And I think Max has even more pace in his car as well that he hasn't fully unlocked this weekend. But I do think that is kind of another interesting element to this is like, are these cars fast but fragile? Do you like the reliability of what we've seen from Ferrari, even if maybe there's just a touch more pace on a circuit like this than Red Bull? Because one of the things that we've been talking about in our group chat was this circuit has fewer slow corners, which is really where Ferrari dominated Red Bull last week. So without that edge, it's a little bit more even. But yeah, I mean, the Red Bull's supplying their own power unit now, and it remains to be seen how good that's going to be. I agree. Yeah, I mean, it's a clear 1-2 with Ferrari and Red Bull. God love Alpine just sitting there at 5 and 7 right now. Just, with McLaren in such a mess right now, Alpine is the fourth best team. And hell, it's unbelievable to think that we might be able to say Alpine is the third best team right now just because of consistency.
Yep. Yeah. Consistency. And again, all of these teams and cars just trying to figure out what the car is. I mean, even with Magnussen qualifying well today, we saw on that final qualifying lap the porpoising, the bouncing on that car was just insane. You mentioned McLaren. They actually showed a little bit of pace compared to last week. Getting to Q2, starting 11 and 12. So I think that is interesting. Let's talk about what you mentioned earlier though, that Haas, that Schumacher crash, and now he is officially out tomorrow. There are some really interesting ramifications for especially for DFS. So again, all of us are very new to Formula One DFS because it's only been out for 2 weeks now. So one of the rules in there, if a driver withdraws and there's no replacement driver, the teammate would be eligible for the beat teammate stat. So Magnussen's starting with 5 points, basically. Yeah. He's starting top 10, and he's getting 5 points because he's going to finish ahead of his teammate. If I have this correct, everybody in P15 through P20, they'll still start there. There should be an empty grid spot at P14, which means all of those drivers that would have started behind Schumacher will start with +1 spot versus grid. They're basically going to, they're going to, if they're starting in 20th, they're automatically going to be 19th. So it gets them that much closer to those bonus points for moving up your spot versus your grid. We got the 3, the 5, and the 10 move up. So that'll be, I mean, probably the only racer that has a real shot to move up a ton of spots is maybe Lewis back there, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, I mean that's also going to be one of those. I would like to amend that just briefly to say the only one that you can maybe think has a realistic shot to do it, because I do think there's a possibility that someone in the back of the pack could move up a bunch of spots just because of the potential chaos. But banking on it. True. The other thing, and this is where it's going to be a little bit different from this week than last week. We talked about on the intro pod how you don't really have to pay too much attention once you get through. You don't have to get up super early on a Sunday morning the way you do with NFL.
Right.
But I wonder if Mercedes is going to risk taking the penalty on Hamilton and try to see if there's something they can do to upgrade that car between now and 1 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, and just bump, like he'd be bumping from 16 to 20. It's not like he's moving a ton, and it's not like even with the car he's got now, the cars that he'd be right behind immediately. Like he's behind the Williams cars. He's not going to be slow compared to those cars. So that's going to be just something to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
I wouldn't bank on it one way or another, but that, I mean, probably increases his value, and we'll get into his value a little bit more at some point here. But yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point on Magnussen, but he's also a guy who's never, he's the one, he and Zhao are the two guys in this race who have never run a full race on this track. So it's kind of interesting to think like, yeah, he's locked in. He can't finish with negative points. He can finish with 0 because if he wrecks out of the race, he'll end up with -5 for falling, the number of spots down the grid. But he, like you said, he's going to have the 5 points locked in. But does that make him more valuable than a guy like Bottas, who's in his general salary class? I mean, probably.
Yeah, well, I mean, on that point, let's kind of jump right into it. Let's jump into how we think we're going to be approaching this DFS slate. I mean, the first thing that we want to be looking at is it's DFS. So, do we have any value? So, a couple things we could look at. We could look at the salaries versus where they're starting on the grid, or the salaries versus the betting odds. The one that really stands out that jumps off the page is Esteban Ocon. His 5,600 salary is 13th among salary, starting in 5th position, so +8 if we look at his salary rank versus grid position. And then if we look at his betting odds, I believe he has I believe they gave him the 11th best odds, so +6 there. I'm sorry.
Okay.
7th best odds. So yeah, so +6 there. So he's the one that really stands out as a salary, I think. Sergio Perez starting at the top of the grid with the 5th salary. Alonso starting 7th on the grid with the 11th highest salary. And then Daniel Ricciardo, not a horrible value, 4,200 gives him the 16th highest salary, but 12th on the grid, really close to his teammate Lando Norris starting 11th. So maybe chasing a +5 from Ricciardo at 4,200 won't be a bad salary. So any of these values, just based on their starting grid position versus their salary, pop to you?
The Ricciardo one is interesting because last week he hadn't been able to run that car at all in Bahrain, and he still managed to beat his teammate. So so that's an interesting shout there. Yeah, I mean the Alpine drivers, both of them, any way that you can find to get them in, because they're just fairly reliable guys. Like last year in this race, Ocon finished 4th, and Alonso finished 13th. So he didn't do great, but he also was able to stay in the race. So, those cars are, like we talk about, sometimes maybe there might be some more variance. You might be able to see another guy kind of rise up the ranks compared to somebody else. But, I think they're, generally speaking, without saying, okay, these guys are definitely going to wreck, I think their floor is also reasonably low. Like, obviously, the challenge with those two guys is going to be the +5. Where you're 100% confident and for fact now you're going to get it with Magnussen, and you're very likely to get it with Bottas. So maybe Bottas at like 7,600 is more valuable than Ocon at 5,600 for that reason. But maybe not when you can maybe allocate that $2,000 on Ocon to somebody else.
Yeah, and we'll jump into ownership, probable or projected ownership in a minute here, but I do think that those middle salary guys, and I guess Bottas is at 7,600 isn't too far. He's like on the high end of the middle salary guys, but Ocon, Fernando, Alonso, and Bottas I think are going to be the really interesting ones because you have Ocon and Alonso starting relatively high on the grid, both top 7. With Ocon being 5,600, I think he'll probably be what we had from Bottas last week in terms of that sub 6K guy that's just going to be in a ton of lineups to help things fit. And then Bottas 7,600 and some more middling lineups. I think he'll be used a fair amount as well. A couple other cheap guys, I think Alexander Albon and Lance Stroll will be popular, very cheap guys just because they are probably fairly likely to get that +5. It looks like Stroll, I want to say comfortably, but ahead of Nico Hulkenberg a little bit there. And then Albon with Latifi not even getting out of Q1, Albon looks like a decent player to target at 3,200 to chase those plus fives. Anything else stand out to you from values? I mean, the one that we were talking about before we hopped on air is does Lewis have enough upside starting that low on the grid to make you even consider him? The problem is his salary is all the way up at 10.2. So like he needs to basically have a perfect race for you to even consider him, because if you're paying that much, you kind of want to be locking in a winner, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, he's got to be a guy that does really well. Let me, first off, I just want a clerical thing, fix something that I said that was incorrect earlier. You can add Hulkenberg to the list of guys. So there's three guys, Jal, Hulkenberg, and Magnussen, who haven't raced this circuit before.
Okay, yep.
But yeah, I mean, with Lewis, just kind of looking through the math, his ceiling, again, without chaos in front of him, is probably fifth. And if that's the case, then fifth place gets you 10 points. Beating your teammate gets you 5 points. Going up 10 spots gets you 5 points. And finishing as a classified driver gets you 1 point. So, as I'm sitting here right now, Lewis Hamilton's ceiling is 21 points, which means you're probably going to need him to be like, that's about puts him better than what I think the guys who are going to finish third or fourth are going to do. So there are some lineup possibilities where maybe you can captain Verstappen, use Red Bull as your constructor, and have Lewis in your lineup, and maybe that will end up being a winning strategy. But man, I love Lewis Hamilton. I'm a Hamilton fan, but man, that's asking a lot of a guy who just doesn't seem like he has a great handle on the machine he is driving. We talked about it, like he's just so far behind Russell. Forget the Ferraris and Red Bulls. He's just so far behind his teammate right now that it's hard for me to want to say, okay, I want to commit that kind of salary to a guy who's like the third highest salary on the board when, barring chaos, you can bet Verstappen and Leclerc are going to finish in the top 3 or 4. And with Hamilton, you just have absolutely no way to predict that's going to happen. It might be a contrarian play. Like if you're entering multiple lineups, there might be a lot of people who like, there are still going to be ways where you can fit Max and Leclerc in your lineups, but maybe it's a contrarian play because some people might try to figure out a way to do that.
Yeah.
But man, it's just a lot to ask.
I definitely don't think even though he does have a ton of finishing upside versus his grid position, I just don't think there's enough there with his salary. If you're getting somebody like if for some reason like Lewis struggles and we see his salary tumble to a George Russell level, if he's at 8,600 instead of 10.2, and we think he can move up 10 positions, finish top 5 and get those points for moving up the grid, then we're in business. I think 10.2 is a little too much to consider him a value even with that upside, but you mentioned that he is a potential contrarian play. So let's jump into some, we'll call it ownership projections. We don't have hard projections right now, but I do think ownership shakes out very interestingly this week because with Sergio taking pole at the very end, I think it really balances everything out between Red Bull and Ferrari. It was really going to be set up, I think, for people to really mimic what we saw in terms of everything going towards Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc last week. And I think Red Bull was going to dominate constructor. Now, I think we probably see Ferrari and Red Bull, who combined for over 85% of constructor last week. That probably is similar, but I think the ownership between them is much more balanced than it would have been had Ferrari finished 1-2 or something like that. Last week, Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc both were over 60% ownership. I don't know if Max gets that high again because he is finishing in 4th, so we might get a little bit of ownership of value on Max. Any thoughts on how it shakes out at the top? Because I still think Ferrari and Red Bull dominate ownership, but I just think it ends up being way more balanced than it would have been had Sergio not taken pole.
I honestly, maybe I'm believing too much in Max Verstappen, but I actually think Sergio Perez getting the pole in this race was the best possible thing that could have happened if you want to roster Max Verstappen.
Oh, I absolutely agree.
Because look, Sergio Perez is a really nice guy. He's a really good driver, but man, he's at best he's the third best guy in this race at best. Like he's not as good as Max. He's not as good as Leclerc, and the car overall reliability, like might be more. It's just not as reliable. It might be a little bit faster, but to me, I think his peak is being the guy. And I know qualifying is his first pole, and I know it's not ever really been his thing, but to me, I'd much rather still have Max Verstappen, who, you can maybe look at it from a contrarian point of view and say, well, he was flying in practice yesterday and then kind of had a mistake towards the end that kind of ruined his best lap. I know they widened the turn where he wrecked in qualifying last year. He didn't seem to quite get as much out of the car today as he wanted to. He was complaining about the tires today, but man, right now, I still think that Max Verstappen's the best driver in the world. I love Lewis Hamilton, but the car's not there for Lewis Hamilton, and Leclerc's going to be with him all year. But I just think that for me, I'd still rather, I know the salary, you might be thinking you're getting value on Sergio Perez, but you're really not. The only way you have value on him is if he wins.
Right, exactly, and that's the thing that two things I think we really need to be thinking about when we're building lineups. Being able, having a realistic shot at winning without an incident, accruing all of those laps led points with the winning, and then being able to multiply that in your captain position is just going to really give you a ton of upside. That the constructor multiplier is going to come from having those two guys finish in the top 4 or 5. But if you are playing a Sergio Perez at 9,200, it's going to be we don't know if there are going to be lineup builds where playing Perez and Verstappen is viable in terms of upside with two drivers from the same team in one lineup. If you play Sergio and Red Bull and he doesn't get the win, how much are you losing for the teams that have Max over Sergio? So I agree. I think I think it's going to really give us an edge in terms of Max not being, instead of being in, I don't know, 50% of captain lineups, if he ends up in 35% or something, I think the edge is there. I think what we really need to be looking at when we're thinking about ownership, again, it's so early in F1 DFS. It's obviously in its uber infancy. Looking at who is going to be popular for these good teams compared to their teammates. So we know Leclerc is going to be way more popular than Sainz. If we look at Alpine, Ocon being cheaper and finishing better is probably going to be in a lot more lineups than Alonso. Knowing that this could be a very high incident track, really taking the advantage on ownership where things are a lot closer than the betting odds or the salaries might prompt you to think, is where we could find a lot of our edges. Again, especially this week when we could have a high rate of incident.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's a really, that's going to be valuable of where these guys are in comparison to their teammates. And the Ocon value is good, but both of those guys, I would probably try to find a way to get those guys in there because they seem fairly reliable. And they're not super expensive. When you look at it, comparatively, the Alpine drivers at 5,662, still less than Lando Norris, who did not have a good race, still less than Pierre Gasly, who Pierre Gasly, I would figure to probably get the 5 points over Yuki the way Yuki's car has looked this week. But the AlphaTauri, like we've talked about, has the reliability issues. And then, maybe Bottas, but is Bottas going to, you're paying extra money for the peace of mind that Bottas is going to finish ahead of Zhao, and you're not really sure who's going to finish first amongst the two Alpine drivers. But, if you're trying to find a way to construct a lineup, maybe that's the price that you have to pay.
Yeah, I think that the two drivers that really stand out to me in terms of relatively low ownership that we could see in a lot of winning lineups are Carlos Sainz and Fernando Alonso. They're just going to be in so many fewer lineups than their teammates. They're both on really strong teams, and I think there is going to be some opportunity for playing them with their constructor for a lot of upside. So let's get into who we are looking at for our captains. I mean, I think everybody, I do think that Red Bull and Ferrari are going to dominate captains. Obviously, Leclerc is going to be in a ton of lineups because he won last week, still finishing second on the grid. How are you feeling about the captain? I mean, let's just talk about the top four guys right now. Any Red Bull or Ferrari guy that looks like a favorite player to captain?
Probably. I mean, I'm probably just higher on Verstappen than everybody
Mm-hmm.
else. And I think it's just going to come down to price. I think it's
Yeah.
just, he's for the captaincy, he's $1,300 or $1,200, excuse me, cheaper than Leclerc. So, I don't know exactly. Like, I haven't run all of the permutations, but like to me, I like having an extra $1,200 in my pocket if I need it for, a guy who, like, if you look at the race odds, Leclerc is plus 130 to win, Verstappen's plus 270. So the books think that, Leclerc is, a much bigger favorite there. But I mean, I still think that Max Verstappen's a tough guy to go against. But I don't really have a preference. I still think that if everything goes the way it should, I would still favor Max and Charles over their teammates in most of these DFS formats. I think even though Sergio finished first, I still just trust Max more as a driver. And then when it comes to the Ferrari drivers, since the start of last year, when they have both finished in the points, Leclerc has beaten Sainz 13 out of 16 times. So typically when he is running well, he is going to be better than Sainz.
Yep.
So, and he's, if you look at the qualifying, he's a one spot ahead of him. So that's going to just kind of be interesting to see how that plays out. But it's also fascinating again, because you now have the drivers. These two teams are grid spots 1 through 4, and there's going to be a lot of battling early on. So like maybe you would say, okay, well, maybe I can be contrarian with, maybe somebody else on the board. But like, man, I don't really see who I would like to favor more than the top two guys.
Yeah.
Even in a race with high variance, like if you just assume that this is going to be Max and it's going to be Leclerc most of the year instead of Hamilton and Verstappen, I think until we see legitimate evidence, like if we have another race, if in the first 4 or 5 races we continue to see the reliability issues with Red Bull, maybe you just kind of have to auto fire on the Ferrari drivers.
Yep.
To me, it's the first two guys. Like, what is your strategy when you look at your captaincy?
Yeah, we're obviously going to see races where the big two teams aren't taking P1. For now, in this race, with them looking so much better than everybody, even though we do have a potential high incident, I just think the vast majority of our lineups, the 1.5x multiplier on that captain spot for getting a P1 in that spot is just going to be really hard to overcome if you are trying to take down a tournament, especially with so many possible dupes out there. You just need to separate yourself from the field. If you're playing a single entry tournament or only playing like a 3max tournament, it's going to be really hard to get away from those two teams in your captain spot, from those two drivers in your captain spot. If you're playing 20 to 150 lineups, I think it would make sense to sprinkle in a couple other drivers in the captain spot, whether it be Perez or Steins, or maybe even a wild card like one of the guys from Alpine. But it's not something that I think should should dominate your lineup building strategy. Before we talk about how we might stack those captain spots, or if we will even stack those captain spots, anything stand out to you from constructors, besides the obvious Red Bull and Ferrari?
No, and I think like I went back and I kind of did the math on like if the race itself. Can you hear that, by the way? If I disappear, my power went out.
No, you sound good.
Okay, it's thunderstorming outside, so if I disappear, I lost power.
Sure.
I went back and I did the math. Had the Red Bulls not crapped out last week and had everything else gone the way that it did, like Ferrari ended up getting 61 points, Red Bull got 37, and Mercedes got 25.7, and Mercedes isn't getting, like, it just doesn't seem like Mercedes is getting that. So like maybe Alpine might be the team that kind of fills the void a little bit in terms of like both drivers end up getting points. It could be, but even if it's anybody else, just the ceiling is just so much higher for those top two teams that to me, like if you're until you're trying to roster contrarian lineups just in case there's chaos, to me it doesn't make sense, at least in my mind, to take anyone other than the top two.
Yeah, I think the only way I'm getting away from a Red Bull Ferrari build is with Alpine, and I think the way to maximize the points in that situation is to stack an Alpine constructor with, say, like a lower owned Fernando Alonso versus Esteban Ocon, and then do something like captain Max Verstappen, drive Charles Leclerc, and you're hoping you still get a 1-2 from Verstappen and Leclerc. But if there's, say, an incident between Sergio and Sainz, then you can potentially get two Alpine drivers in, say, the top four, get the points from that from your Alpine position, get your +5, and hopefully a top three from Alonso. I think that kind of combination could make sense if you're stacking your one of the Alpine drivers with Alpine constructor, and you're not hoping for an incident, but playing as if there might be an incident between a Red Bull and Ferrari, which is obviously possible with all of them packed so closely together in the grid. I think a build like that could make sense.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I'm just kind of like, to me, I always have to look at all the numbers, and if like the Alpine drivers can get a fourth and a sixth,
Right.
that's 20 points plus 2 more points for being classified and then finishing. So that's a 27 points for Alpine, which to me feels roughly about their ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, at that point, you're going to almost certainly need one of the Red Bull and Ferrari drivers to not perform particularly well.
Yeah.
So again, and that's entirely possible. Like the one thing that we haven't really we didn't even talk about in the recap from the other race was it's going to be kind of fun. The narrative's going to build over time that Verstappen and Leclerc have this like long history of not necessarily getting along on the track, back to their karting days. Like Verstappen and Hamilton was very much an on the track Formula One, old lion versus young buck kind of rivalry. It's different with Verstappen and Leclerc. They've been racing each other forever. And at a certain point, it's going to be kind of, okay, well, now these two guys are going to want to go at each other. And that's another thing that like we have to think about that we haven't really addressed is like how badly last weekend went for Red Bull. How aggressive are they going to be in subsequent races, because they are in a massive gap for the World Drivers' Championship and an even more massive gap for the Constructors' Championship based on how last week went. So does that like alter how they're going to attack? Maybe not this week, because this track is just so chaotic, but maybe this week. Like at a certain point, they're going to have to kind of take some chances and go for some things, because they're going to have to make up the gap that they created last week for themselves because of their unreliability at the end.
Yeah, so I think trying to figure out how they are going to push in terms of like balancing what you said, the high likelihood of an incident at this track, but also like being way behind the 8 ball in terms of how many points they lost last week. And I think that's going to kind of tie into how much we, if we do think that they could gain back some of those points, and we can see like if we get a Perez a Max Sergio 1-2 finish, that's where they could really gain a lot of ground, and that's where we can really pay off with like a Max Verstappen Red Bull stack, which basically flips what we saw last week with the Leclerc Ferrari stack in terms of your captain and constructor. So in terms of how we are going to be stacking these guys, we saw captain constructor dominate last week. At Bahrain, 93% of the top 1% lineups in the big tournament, and 81% of lineups that cash used a captain and constructor stack. I don't think that you need to be building 95% of your lineups with the captain constructor stack, especially with the salary constraints that it can put on you. Are there any stacks outside of Red Bull, Ferrari, or the captain constructor stack that you are targeting or even fading?
Not really, because again, I think that I think you're going to see kind of the same strategy with the constructor and captain. It's going to remain a top heavy sport, and there's just there's going to be a week where you do it and something happens and one of the Ferraris wrecks and that kind of ruins your week, or one of the Red Bulls. I mean, if you stacked, Verstappen and Red Bull last week, it wrecked your Sunday. So it's going to happen, but I think over 23 races, it's not going to happen that often. So again, I think the only way I can see it is if you're looking to be contrarian, which you probably should be. Like, you never should really just be entering one lineup in any contest. Like, just like give yourself some outs. But yeah, for me, probably not.
Yeah, I think the thing I'm really going to be focusing on this week is stacking constructor with a driver. I think is still going to be very important. I think that there are going to be a lot of ways with potential incidents at this track that you can have a winning lineup without stacking your captain and constructor. So again, even though we saw 93% of those top 1% lineups last week stack captain and constructor, I think, say, if I'm building 100 lineups, I think maybe 35 to 40 of them will stack the constructor with the driver instead of the constructor with the captain. And that's just like, hopefully getting you're kind of in that scenario, kind of trying to hit perfect with, maybe 3 top 4 guys. But then the constructor isn't getting so many points if it's a rainbow podium. No constructor is going to get 61 points like we saw last week with a 1-2. So there are going to be some different ceiling scenarios, but you're always going to have to hit perfect to win these races with such a small player pool, obviously. Right. But giving yourself those chances to be perfect versus the field, exploiting what everybody's doing. Like, DFS isn't always just about predicting what's going to happen. It's predicting what other people are going to do. And if 80% of the field is going to be stacking captain and constructor, then it might make sense for you to have 35% of your lineups without that type of stack. Again, we already went through the potential for an Alpine constructor with one of their driver instead of the captain, so we don't need to recover that. Anything else from a DFS perspective that we haven't covered that isn't encapsulated by captain, constructor, stacks talk?
No, I'm just kind of like, for me, it's trying to figure out if there's a strategy of playing like if you're expecting chaos to actually happen, what does an optimal lineup in your mind look like?
Yeah, I think the thing that building for chaos sounds good, but what that really means in practice, again, say you're maxing out a 150 lineup tournament, it doesn't mean just like spraying your drivers all over the place, just trying to cover every single base. It's just taking stands and spots that you might not. So, for example, last week I think I had Verstappen and Leclerc, and I think I had in like 85% of lineups, including my captain position. Probably this week I'm not going to do that. Probably with the likelihood that there is an incident somewhere, having lineups where I'm rotating in Steins or Perez or even a dark horse like one of the Alpine guys into those captain spots, just giving myself enough outs to where if something crazy does happen, that we are able to recover versus the field. Building lineups where Red Bull and Ferrari just don't completely dominate. Again, we've talked about that with Alpine so much. The one thing I don't see a George Russell from last week where somebody that started like 10th, even though they don't beat their teammate, to have enough upside to be in that winning lineup. I think this week looks like the variance is going to come from having 5 cars that all beat their teammates this week. I think that's probably what you're going to need to do.
Yeah, I just brought up the qualifying again just because I wanted to look at it. Yeah, like the area where you might get the guys moving up, like maybe it could be in those cars that might be a little decent. So like basically from 5 down to, I would say, 12, that Ocon, Russell, Alonso, Bottas, Gasly, Magnussen, Norris, Ricciardo group, like you might see the +5 in that group. You might.
Sure.
And like identifying that, like, Kevin Magnussen finished 5th last week. Is there another scenario where you're getting the +5 there and then you get the 3-point bonus for Kevin Magnussen for finishing 5th again in this race? Might be worth it. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to kind of project, which is maybe why, like, if you think that the reliability is not a concern for Gasly, maybe there's some like extra value in Bottas, Gasly, and Magnussen, and maybe even Norris and Ricciardo versus Ocon, Russell, and Alonso, because it's hard for me to see those guys improving themselves to get those extra points that they may get. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it definitely makes a lot of sense. I think Gasly is probably an interesting dark horse. If we do get an incident between Red Bull and Ferrari, we saw him really pushing for a 4th place finish last week. I think if he can climb 5 spots, 6 spots, get that and get a 3rd place finish somehow, if a Ferrari and a Red Bull or one of them get knocked out, he's probably the one that can really climb up. So he is interesting. Magnussen starting with that +5 is interesting. Is there anybody like in the back? We already talked about Lewis. Like he's the one that can really climb up the grid, but he's so expensive. Do you see anybody else that has a chance to climb the grid?
Um, Probably
Is
not.
Yuki? Do
Like,
we have? Is there any chance Yuki climbs the grid if his car is reliable?
sure, like
Yeah.
that's the one. Like, yeah,
Mhm.
maybe Yuki can jump. Like, maybe Yuki can jump up to. Let's assume. I'm going to assume Hamilton's going to finish better than 16th. I'm going to assume Hamilton. I'm going to put Hamilton on the cusp of points here. Like, is the Alpha Tauri, if it's not a complete piece of like unable to run better than the Williams, the Aston Martin, the McLaren right now, it has been, yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe Tsunoda in that regard, but it comes back to the comment earlier in the chat. Like, man, I am just so gun shy about
Sure.
rostering an AlphaTauri driver because of the reliability issues that they've had so far this season. And yeah, I mean, I think you also have to factor that in, like I said, with Red Bull. But Yuki could definitely, if everything goes well for him, like we saw Magnussen's car kind of crap out on him on Saturday last week. He was able to get it running enough to get one good qualifying lap and get into the top 10. And then he ran really well on Sunday. But like, sure, Yuki might have a little bit of value there. You might be able to pull that off with Yuki, but man, it's tough for me to want to really pull the trigger on an AlphaTauri driver.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about Yuki is that he is at that salary where I think a lot of people are going to be playing Lance Stroll and Alexander Albon to try to get that +5. That should, with them being at very similar salary to Yuki's 3,600, I think we could see a situation where Yuki's like, 7-8%, and then those two guys are somewhere between 25 and 35%. Even if they get the +5, if Yuki could somehow climb, if he could suck out with incidents and the Red Bull gives the pace that the AlphaTauri gives the pace that we saw from those cars through most of the race last week. If he squeezes out a P10 starting from 20th on the grid at 3,600 at low ownership, I think that's an interesting one.
I mean, that's definitely fair for sure.
Let's wrap this thing up with the betting market. We talked before, we didn't see a ton of value to squeeze out of the betting market, but what jumps out to you?
Look, the books. It looks like the American books are all are heading to the Max Verstappen to win the race at +270.
Yeah.
I'm still a believer that he has more to get out of the car than he's shown this weekend. He's also someone who he's the defending world champion. It's kind of like a principal bet for me. Like it was Lewis Hamilton ended up being a really bad bet last week, but man, at the time we just didn't know how bad that car was, and now we know that even at like Lewis Hamilton's +5,000. Or it was like +6,500 in some places. Okay, I'll buy that. Like maybe Leclerc and Perez are better than that, but like, man, it's Max Verstappen. Then, like I said, he's just a guy who's so good, and he's so good on race day that getting like that kind of odds on him. I'm hoping we're going to get to see some matchup. There were some qualifying matchups today. Shout out to anyone who was on the Perez over Verstappen at +750.
Yeah.
I know some people who had Perez to win qualifying and had the head-to-head with Max. So they're probably just going to retire from betting on car racing from now on. But the other thing that I think is kind of interesting is just like, given that Nicholas Latifi wrecked and that Yuki Tsunoda has had issues with his car all weekend, first driver retirement market, like there could be just all kinds of chaos, and maybe that's a weird thing, but I love long shots, and Yuki's +1100, and he didn't get out of qualifying, and he had issues in practice. Like that's interesting. And Latifi wrecked yesterday, although Latifi's been pretty reliable at least just he'll finish 19th, but he's going to finish 19th. Like he'll stay on the grid. Yeah, it's still a market where they're not really offering a ton. Yeah. But like I bet the Verstappen to win the race. I just to me, I just can't look here. I just feel stupid if like Max Verstappen ends up winning that race tomorrow. And I was like, yeah, he was +270 in a really good car, and he doesn't end up winning. Like that was one I was just like, man, I kind of have to pull the trigger on this, so I did.
Yeah, I mean, it's rare that you're going to see Max at that number. I mean, it's rare he's going to start fourth, but we know qualifying and racing are very much different, and Max can freaking race. There's some decent fastest laps. You got Max and Leclerc both at +165 for fastest lap on DK. Red Bull is plus money for fastest lap. on DK, so I think those are kind of interesting. I don't think anyone's going to bet this because people just don't like betting minus 1,000. But the safety car, seeing a safety car at minus 1,000, like, I mean, I don't know if you're being facetious or serious. You think it should be minus 10,000?
I'm being a little facetious, but like it feels like it's a pretty safe bet that it's going to happen. Like I'm not the kind of person who's going to bet 1,000 to 1 on things, but it probably should be like 2,500 or 3,000 to 1, more so than that. All right, here I'm going to throw this out just real quick. Lewis Hamilton versus George Russell head to head. Hamilton plus 225. Do you think there's any chance he pulls off that win against Russell?
Russell starting at P6. I mean, I think there's probably a little juice to be squeezed out of that. I mean, if Mercedes has a car starting in P6, you got to think that Lewis is going to feel like he can push there. And again, I mean, high incident, right? So I mean, the best the best driver in history. Who's to say Russell just doesn't have an incident at some point?
Right now they have Stroll versus Hulkenberg, Russell versus Hamilton, Verstappen versus Perez, and Gasly versus Tsunoda, and Bottas versus Joe, excuse me. And I'm sure you can imagine there's not a ton of value on Gasly or Bottas. Yeah. Hulkenberg plus 275 is a little interesting to me, just because like those cars are close to each other on the grid. Stroll's got a better car, but like whatever. And then, man, I don't know if just the high possibility of incident, maybe there's a little bit of value on like taking a flyer on just a long shot here and hoping that maybe there's some chaos.
Yeah, we've talked about this quite a bit leading up to the season and just over the past week or so, that if we can get some more of these matchup props, I think that's where we're finally going to start seeing some things that are really interesting to bet. So hopefully we see FanDuel and DraftKings, if the popularity starts to grow, we see them offering some more of these matchups. Any last thoughts before we get out of here?
No, I mean, I think we covered just about everything, and we kept it under an hour, which was a goal. So I think that's a pretty good way to go about it.
Yeah, and again, we'll be doing these previews every week. I think the exciting thing is that there's so little time that just like everybody else, we're trying to digest these qualifying results as fast as possible, and the difference between this end of this podcast and locking lineups tomorrow, things could change just once we start formulating them. So make sure you are following us so we can tweet out any of those updates or answer any questions you have. Make sure you're checking out everything we're doing. We're back on Monday with myself and Sam Hoppen for the recap of the Saudi Arabian GP. If you are familiar with 4for4 but don't yet have a subscription, we are running a promotion. You can get a free pro 4for4 sub if you deposit at least $10 on Underdog Fantasy using the promo code 4for4. You'll also get a bonus deposit match up to $100. Underdog has the absolute best ball games already running best ball, and they will have a big tournament coming up, which we'll be covering with a ton of content on 4for4. Must be a new Underdog user. See the link in the description for that. Make sure you're checking out the 4for4 betting plan. Get access to all of our betting advice. Tons of stuff. Golf season is getting into full swing. Masters coming up, and on that note, make sure you're checking out BetSperts Golf for the big Masters launch, and keep an eye out for the BetSperts bundle. We're going to have a really cool plan coming up. So anything under the BetSperts umbrella you could get for one low price. Make sure you're keeping an eye out for that. Make sure you like and subscribe if you are watching us on YouTube. If you're listening on the DFS MVP podcast, please rate and review on iTunes or Spotify. And like I said, make sure you're following all of us. 4for4 is at 4for4football. Check out BetSperts Golf on Twitter at BetSperts Golf. Dan is at really Dan Weiner. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys on Monday.